Look into the eyes of a man who has just fulfilled his most painful duty. This is Temujin, soon to be Genghis Khan, after ordering the execution of Jamukha, the brother who knew his secrets, shared his childhood, and swore eternal loyalty. Blood brothers who became bitter enemies across the vast battlefields of Mongolia. Tonight, we followed the betrayal that broke the future Great Khan, a friendship that began with innocent games and ended when Jamukha's own followers handed him over, defeated and betrayed. If these powerful historical journeys help you unwind, a gentle like and subscribe will get you more stories that will keep you captivated. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Now let the story transport you to when two children's friendship began a chain of events that would reshape the ancient world. It was winter, in the year 1173. Legend says that two 11-year-old boys knelt on the frozen Onon River, casting bone dice into the bitter wind. One owned nothing, the other owned everything. Temujin's breath formed clouds in the icy air as he watched his knuckle bones skitter across the ice. His father was dead, poisoned by enemies. His tribe had abandoned his family like unwanted dogs. Now they survived by fishing through holes in the ice and eating whatever his mother could scavenge. Jamukha smiled as his bone landed true. The son of Jadaran nobles, he wore a coat lined with fine wool and ate warm meat every night. Yet something about this ragged and half-hungry boy fascinated him. Maybe it was how Temujin never begged, never complained, never looked away in shame. "Take this," Jamukha said suddenly, offering his carved bone. A gift between friends. Temujin hesitated, then held out his own piece of bone. "Then take mine." With that simple exchange, two children bound themselves together in the sacred Mongol tradition of Anda, sworn brothers closer than family. They didn't know they had just planted the seeds of Mongolia's greatest friendship and most bitter rivalry. But already, the differences showed. When other boys played war games, Jamukha commanded because nobility was his birthright. Temujin earned his place by listening, planning, treating everyone fairly. Jamukha had learned to rule. Temujin had learned to survive. The harsh steppes didn't care about bloodlines. Winters killed the noble and common alike. Raids could destroy anyone's herds. Disease struck rich and poor. But how you responded to these dangers, that revealed who you really were. Jamukha believed in the old ways. Noble families led because their ancestors had proven worthy. The system worked because everyone knew their place. Change was dangerous. Temujin had watched capable herders ignored while incompetent nobles made deadly mistakes. He'd seen brave warriors passed over for promotion because they lacked the right family name. Maybe birth mattered less than ability. Neither boy understood what they were really creating. Two completely different visions for Mongolia's future, wrapped in the innocent friendship of children playing dice on a frozen river. As spring broke the ice on the Onon, both boys treasured their new bond. Jamukha had found someone who respected him as a person, not just a title. Temujin had found someone who treated him as an equal despite his family's disgrace. They promised to help each other always. They shared dreams of glory and conquest. They swore their friendship would last forever. They had no idea that one day only one of them could survive. The knuckle bones lay forgotten in the grass as they clasped hands, two boys who would grow into men destined to tear Mongolia apart. In years to come, when armies clashed and empires hung in the balance, both would remember this moment. The last time their friendship was pure, the last time they were just children, before the weight of ruling the world crushed the love between them. But that winter day, they were simply brothers by choice, the closest bond two Mongols could share. It would also become the most dangerous. Chapter 2: The Rescue That Changed Everything. Years passed. The starving boy became a young warrior. Temujin, now 19, had claimed his bride Berta from her family and brought her home to his small camp. For the first time since his father's death, life felt hopeful. Then came the night that shattered everything. 300 Merkid warriors thundered into Temujin's camp like a winter storm. They had come for revenge. Years earlier, Temujin's father had stolen a Merkid woman. Now, they would take his. "Run!" Temujin shouted to his brothers as arrows whistled through the darkness. They grabbed horses and fled toward the sacred mountain, Burkan Khaldun. But Berta couldn't reach a horse in time. The Merkids dragged her away into the night, along with Temujin's stepmother. By morning, his small camp was ash, and his wife was gone. Temujin sat in the ruins, facing a terrible truth. His ragged band of followers couldn't rescue anyone. He needed help, real help, from someone with an army. There was only one person he could trust: Jamukha. The journey to find his sworn brother felt like crawling through broken glass. Every step reminded Temujin of his weakness, his failure to protect what mattered most. But when Jamukha saw his Anders' desperate face, something old and deep stirred in him. "Brother," Jamukha said simply, "tell me what you need." Soon, two armies gathered under the endless sky. Jamukha commanded 20,000 warriors, a force that made the earth tremble when it moved. Togrul, the Genghis Khan and Temujin's father's old friend, brought another 20,000, 40,000 riders, all for one kidnapped woman. It wasn't really about Berta, though she mattered. This was about honor, about the sacred bonds between sworn brothers, about proving that some things in this harsh world were still worth fighting for. The combined force moved like thunder across the steppes. When they struck the Merkid camps, it was total destruction. The enemy scattered like leaves in a storm. Buildings burned. Warriors fell. The secret history would later say it was the end of the men and their descendants. In the chaos, Temujin rode frantically between burning gers, shouting his wife's name. Through smoke and screaming, somewhere in the distance, Berta heard him calling. She answered, and somehow, miraculously, they found each other. But victory carried a price no one expected. Berta was pregnant. The child might be Temujin's, but it might be her Merkid captors. In Mongol society, this kind of uncertainty could destroy a man's reputation forever. Some warriors might have abandoned such a wife. Temujin didn't hesitate. "The child will be mine," he declared. When the boy was born, he named him Jochi and raised him as his own son. But questions would follow Jochi his entire life. The rescue changed everything between the sworn brothers too. For 18 months, Temujin lived in Jamukha's camp, as a junior partner. On the surface, it looked perfect. Two friends reunited, sharing resources and planning raids together. But power is a strange thing. It reveals who people really are. Jamukha commanded because he was born to command. He made decisions quickly, expecting immediate obedience. When he distributed loot from raids, noble families got the best shares. Common warriors took what was left. This was tradition. This was order. Temujin watched everything. He saw capable men ignored because they lacked proper bloodlines. He noticed how Jamukha's quick decisions sometimes caused problems that slower, more careful thought might have prevented. He watched talented herders and warriors grow frustrated with their low positions. Slowly, quietly, Temujin began doing things differently. When Jamukha wasn't watching, he'd ask common soldiers for their opinions. He'd remember their names, their families, their concerns. He'd listen to ideas from anyone, regardless of their birth. People noticed. Word spread through the camp. The young Temujin treated everyone with respect, that he valued ability over ancestry, that he asked questions instead of just giving orders. Jamukha noticed too. At first, it seemed like harmless differences between friends. But as months passed, tiny cracks appeared in their relationship. Jamukha's followers began looking toward Temujin with something that looked dangerously like hope. Some even started making quiet comments about which man might make a better long-term leader. The breaking point came with a riddle. One evening, as they prepared to move camp, Jamukha spoke cryptically about how leaders should behave. His words seemed innocent enough, but his wife Berta understood the hidden message. So did others who heard it. "He's insulting you," Berta told Temujin that night, "and he's warning that he grows tired of having you here. We should leave while we still can." Temujin stared into the darkness for a long time. Leaving would mean breaking the sacred bond of Brotherhood. It would mean abandoning the safety of Jamukha's protection. It would mean striking out on his own with just a handful of followers. But staying meant accepting a junior position forever. It meant watching capable people held down by an ancient system. It meant abandoning his growing belief that Mongolia could be something greater than a collection of competing tribes. By dawn, Temujin had made his choice. He gathered his small group of followers, maybe a few dozen families, and slipped away from Jamukha's vast camp. No dramatic confrontation, no angry words, just a quiet departure that would echo through history. Neither man knew it yet, but their childhood friendship had just died. In its place, something far more dangerous was being born, a rivalry that would reshape the world. Chapter 3. The First War Between Brothers. The year was 1189. Two men who once shared knucklebones on a frozen river now sat in different camps, each calling himself Khan. The boy who once had nothing now commanded the loyalty of 41 tribal leaders. The boy who once had everything watched his followers desert him, one by one. Temujin's rise had been swift and shocking. When he left Jamukha's camp with his small band of followers, few expected him to survive. But something remarkable happened. Word spread across the steppes about this young leader who treated everyone with respect. who promoted based on ability rather than bloodline, who shared wealth fairly among his warriors. Tribal leaders began arriving at Temujin's camp, not just minor chiefs, but powerful men like Altan, grandson of a great Khan, and Sacha Beki, descendant of royal blood. They came because they saw something new, a leader who listened before he commanded, who valued loyalty over lineage. At Cook Lake, they made it official. In a ceremony that shocked the Mongol world, these nobles elected Temujin as Khan of all Mongols, not Jamukha, the aristocrat with centuries of noble blood, but Temujin, the orphan who had once eaten roots to survive. Jamukha watched this betrayal with growing fury. These were his people, his rightful followers. Many had served under him for years, accepting his leadership, benefiting from his protection. Now they flocked to his former friend like sheep, following a new shepherd. But it wasn't just political ambition that finally pushed them toward war. It was blood. Jamukha's younger brother, Taichar, decided to steal horses from one of Temujin's herders. It should have been a minor raid, the kind of thing that happened constantly between tribes. But Temujin's man fought back and killed Taichar in the struggle. To Jamukha, this wasn't just theft gone wrong. This was murder. This was his former Ander allowing, maybe even ordering, the death of his family. The sacred bonds between them were now stained with his brother's blood. The message Jamukha sent was simple: you have declared war. In 1187, Jamukha assembled 30,000 warriors. This wasn't a raiding party or a show of force. This was an army built to destroy. Tribes that had remained neutral now chose sides. The Taichud, Temujin's old enemies who had once enslaved him, eagerly joined Jamukha's coalition. Word reached Temujin's camp like a cold wind before a storm. Scouts reported the massive force moving toward them, more warriors than most men had ever seen in one place. Jamukha's banners stretched to the horizon. Temujin could have fled. He could have scattered his forces and fought a guerrilla campaign from the mountains. Instead, he chose to meet his former friend in open battle. The armies faced each other at Dalan Baljud, 30,000 warriors on one side, perhaps 15,000 on the other. Jamukha sat his horse before the largest force he had ever commanded. Temujin faced odds that would have terrified most leaders. The battle began with arrow storms that darkened the sky. Mongol warfare was about speed, mobility, and devastating archery. Wave after wave of riders swept past enemy lines, shooting with deadly accuracy before wheeling away. But this fight quickly became something more brutal. When the arrows were exhausted, the warriors charged with swords and spears. Hand-to-hand combat on the steppes was vicious and personal. Men who might have shared meals the year before now tried to kill each other with desperate fury. Jamukha's superior numbers began to tell. Temujin's forces fought bravely, but they were being overwhelmed. Warriors fell. Positions collapsed. The tide of battle turned decisively against the young Khan. By day's end, Temujin's army was broken. Many of his men lay dead on the bloody grass. Others fled in panic. The man who had dared to challenge the established order was now a fugitive, his dreams of empire seemingly shattered. Jamukha's victory should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, he made a decision that would haunt him forever. 70 young warriors had been captured, men from Mongol tribes who had followed Temujin. These weren't foreign enemies. They were fellow Mongols, fellow believers in the same gods, speakers of the same language. Jamukha ordered them boiled alive in great cauldrons. The executions were methodical and horrifying. One by one, the prisoners were forced into boiling water while their comrades watched. Their screams echoed across the battlefield. By Mongol beliefs, this torture didn't just kill the body, it destroyed the soul, preventing any afterlife. The message was clear. This is what happened to anyone who betrayed the natural order, who followed commoners over nobles, who chose merit over birthright. But the message backfired spectacularly. Across the steppes, warriors who had supported Jamukha recoiled in horror. Yes, the prisoners had been enemies. Yes, they had chosen the wrong side. But they were still Mongols. They deserved warrior deaths, not the torture reserved for the worst criminals. Stories of the executions spread like wildfire. Jamukha the noble became Jamukha the butcher. Tribes that had been considering joining his cause turned away in disgust. Warriors who had served him began to question their loyalty. Most importantly, survivors of the battle who escaped to tell their stories painted Temujin not as a defeated rebel, but as a leader worth dying for. Men who had endured torture rather than abandon their Khan clearly served someone special. Temujin himself had escaped the slaughter, wounded but alive. He fled into the wilderness with his remaining followers, maybe a few hundred people from the thousands who had once called him Khan. But in his greatest defeat, the seeds of ultimate victory had been planted. Jamukha had won the battle through superior force, but he had lost something far more important, the moral authority that made people want to follow him. Hidden in the mountains, licking his wounds, Temujin learned harsh lessons about leadership, loyalty, and the price of challenging tradition. He also learned that sometimes your enemy's cruelty could be your greatest weapon. The war between the sworn brothers had officially begun. It would rage for 20 years, reshaping the Mongol world and determining whether the future belonged to the old ways of noble privilege or the new vision of united strength. And somewhere in those mountains, a defeated Khan began planning his return. Chapter 4: The Lost Years. For 10 years, Temujin vanished from history. The man who had been elected Khan of the Mongols simply disappeared into the vast emptiness beyond the steppes. The secret history of the Mongols, which records almost every detail of his life, falls silent. Modern historians believe they know why. Those years were too shameful for official records to acknowledge. Chinese sources tell a different story. A Song dynasty official named Zhao Hong wrote that Temujin spent 10 years as a slave of the Jin dynasty, not hiding in mountains or fighting as an outlaw, but serving the very enemies who had kept Mongolia divided and weak. Imagine the humiliation. The man who had promised to unite all Mongols, now forced to serve the Chinese Empire that played tribes against each other, the proud warrior reduced to whatever work his captors demanded. But this shameful period may have been the making of Genghis Khan. In Jin cities, Temujin saw things impossible on the steppes. Massive walls that could withstand any siege, disciplined armies with sophisticated tactics, administrative systems governing millions across vast distances. He learned their language, studied their methods, memorized their weaknesses. Every humiliation taught him about power and organization. When Chinese officials dismissed him as another barbarian, he quietly absorbed how they controlled their territories. The knowledge would later prove devastating when he turned their own strategies against them. Meanwhile, Jamukha ruled unopposed. His victory at Dalan Baljut had made him undisputed leader of the Mongol Confederation. The traditional system seemed vindicated. Nobility had triumphed over upstart commoners. But power without challenge breeds complacency. The memory of those boiled prisoners didn't fade. It festered. Warriors began questioning whether such cruelty was necessary. Tales spread of how differently Temujin had treated captives, with honor rather than torture. During these lost years, Berta bore their sons Chagatai and Ogedei. Despite defeat and exile, the family endured. Key followers like Jelma never gave up hope, keeping Temujin's vision alive among trusted warriors. By the mid-1190s, whispers circulated. Travelers reported seeing a familiar figure in distant lands. Former followers claimed secret messages promising their Khan would return. Jamukha dismissed these rumors. He had won decisively. He was Mongolia's undisputed master. But in 1196, everything changed. Temujin reappeared as suddenly as he had vanished, not as a broken fugitive, but as a confident leader, ready to reclaim his destiny. He had somehow survived his lost decade and emerged stronger than before. The Jin awarded him an honorary title after he helped them fight the Tatars. The same empire that had enslaved him now treated him as an ally. He had learned to use his enemies' strength against them. The boy who had played with knucklebones on a frozen river was gone forever. In his place stood someone harder, smarter, more dangerous than anyone imagined. The real war between Temujin and Jamukha was about to begin. This time, Temujin brought lessons learned in the depths of defeat, lessons that would reshape the world. Chapter 5. The Return of the Khan. It was summer, in the year 1196. The steppes shimmered under the blazing sun as two armies approached the Tatar camps. One flew the banners of the Jin dynasty, the Chinese empire that had ruled northern lands for decades. The other carried the wolf-tail standards of the Mongols. Leading the Mongol force was a man many thought dead. Temujin had returned. The Tatars were the ancient enemies of all Mongols. They had poisoned Temujin's father. They had murdered countless tribal leaders through treachery and ambush. Now they faced the combined might of their Chinese overlords and their Mongol rivals in a battle that would reshape the balance of power on the steppes. The campaign was a massacre. Tatar warriors, caught between hammer and anvil, were crushed completely. When the dust settled, half their tribe lay dead on the blood-soaked grass. The Jin commanders were so pleased with the destruction that they awarded Temujin an honorary title, Cha-ut-Kuri, meaning commander of hundreds. But this victory meant more than military success. It announced to all Mongolia that Temujin had not only survived his years of exile, but had learned to make even his enemies serve his purposes. The same Jin dynasty that had enslaved him now granted him honors and recognition. Word of his return spread like wildfire across the steppes. The man who had disappeared as a defeated fugitive had come back as a proven war leader with powerful foreign allies. Warriors who had abandoned him after Dalam Baljud began reconsidering their loyalties. Jamukha watched these developments with growing alarm. For 10 years, he had enjoyed unchallenged supremacy. Now his greatest rival had returned, seemingly stronger and more dangerous than ever. The comfortable certainty of noble privilege was about to be tested again. Temujin wasted no time rebuilding his power base. He used his newfound prestige to forge new alliances and reclaim old ones. His most important partnership was with Togrul Khan of the Karaites, who'd been driven from power during Temujin's absence, but now sought to reclaim his throne. The relationship between Temujin and Togrul had evolved during the lost years. Once, Temujin had been clearly the junior partner, grateful for any protection the older Khan could provide. Now they met as near equals, both experienced leaders who understood the value of mutual support. Together, they moved against Togrul's enemies. The Karaite throne had been usurped by Togrul's brother, backed by the powerful Naiman tribe. But the usurper had not counted on facing the combined forces of two determined Khans who had learned hard lessons about loyalty and betrayal. The campaign to restore Togrul succeeded brilliantly. The usurper was defeated, his Naiman allies scattered, and Togrul once again ruled the Karaites. But more importantly, for Temujin, the victory demonstrated that he could be trusted as an ally and feared as an enemy. As the year 1196 ended, Temujin found himself in a stronger position than ever before. He commanded a growing army of loyal followers. He had proven himself in battle against the Tatars. He had powerful allies like Togrul Khan, and he had gained invaluable knowledge during his years among the Jin. But perhaps his greatest advantage was invisible to his enemies. The decade of humiliation and hardship had forged something new in Temujin's character. He had learned patience, strategy, and the long view of power. Where once he might have acted impulsively, he now calculated carefully. Where once he had relied on personal charisma, he now understood the mechanics of administration and governance. Jamukha, comfortable in his traditional stronghold, failed to grasp how much his rival had changed. He still saw Temujin as the same young upstart who had been crushed at Dalan Baljud. He could not imagine that defeat and exile might have been a form of education rather than destruction. The old rivalry was about to resume, but the terms had shifted dramatically. Jamukha still commanded respect through his noble bloodline and traditional authority. But Temujin now offered something entirely different, a vision of what Mongolia could become if it embraced new ways of thinking about power, loyalty, and organization. Across the steppes, tribal leaders began to choose sides. Some remained loyal to Jamukha out of respect for ancient customs and established hierarchies. Others found themselves drawn to Temujin's promise of advancement based on merit rather than birth. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just who ruled Mongolia, but what kind of nation it would become. Would the future belong to the traditional system of inherited privilege that Jamukha represented? Or would it embrace the revolutionary meritocracy that Temujin had learned to implement? In his Jier at night, surrounded by maps and trusted advisors, Temujin planned his next moves with the methodical precision he had learned during his lost years. Every decision was calculated to build toward a larger goal, not just defeating Jamukha, but creating something entirely new on the steppes. The boy who had once shared knuckle bones with his blood brother was gone. The defeated Khan who had fled Dalan Baljud was a memory. In their place sat a man who had seen the world beyond the steppes and understood how to harness its lessons for his own purposes. The return was complete. The real war was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Universal Ruler. It was now spring of the year 1201. 13 tribes gathered on the windswept steppes, their banners black against the storm clouds. The Merkits came seeking revenge. The Tatars thirsted for blood. The Naimans brought their Christian crosses and Western ambitions. They had one shared purpose: destroy Temujin. Their choice of leader was unanimous. Jamukha, the noble-born, the keeper of ancient traditions, the blood brother turned bitter enemy. In a ceremony heavy with desperation, they proclaimed him Gur Khan, universal ruler of all who opposed the Mongol upstart. This should have been Jamukha's moment of triumph. 13 powerful tribes choosing him over Temujin, validating everything he believed about noble blood and rightful authority. But the very circumstances revealed how much had changed. This wasn't a council of victors. It was a coalition of the defeated, desperate tribes fleeing Temujin's relentless expansion. The title Gur Khan was borrowed from the Kara Kitai Empire, carrying ancient weight. Yet it felt hollow when granted by refugees and outcasts rather than triumphant allies. That autumn, the armies met in the Erguna Valley. Jamukha commanded the largest force ever assembled against Temujin. Wave after wave of mounted warriors stretching to the horizon. This was traditional Mongolia at its peak. Proud tribes fighting for honor, nobles leading by birthright, warriors seeking individual glory. But Temujin had learned different lessons. His forces moved with coordination that seemed supernatural. Orders flowed through clear chains of command. Units supported each other with perfect timing. Most importantly, they fought as one people, not separate tribes. The Battle of the 13 Sides became a masterclass in unity versus division. Jamukha's coalition fought bravely using tactics that had dominated the steppes for generations. But when pressure mounted, old rivalries surfaced. The Merkits blamed the Tatars. The Tatars blamed the Naimans. Cooperation crumbled. Temujin's warriors fought with single purpose. Victory meant advancement regardless of birth. Loyalty meant reward. They weren't defending separate tribal honors. They were building something entirely new. By sunset, the great coalition was shattered. Tribes fled in all directions, seeking separate peace deals with the victor. The unity that had seemed so promising dissolved like morning mist. Jamukha survived, but his authority was broken. The title of universal ruler became a bitter joke when the tribes that granted it abandoned him on the battlefield. He had commanded the largest army Mongolia had ever seen and achieved nothing but proving his enemies' superiority. Temujin's response revealed his strategic genius. No massacres or revenge. Instead, he offered honorable surrender terms. Defeated tribes were welcomed into his confederation. Brave enemies were invited to serve in his army. Common warriors could switch sides without penalty. The message was revolutionary. This wasn't about tribal loyalty anymore. This was about choosing the future over the past, merit over birthright, unity over division. The defections began immediately. Leaders who had followed Jamukha for decades sent secret emissaries to Temujin's camp. Warriors tired of endless defeats slipped away to join the winning side. Even Jamukha's most trusted supporters began questioning their loyalty. For Jamukha, the defeat was more than military failure. It was proof that his world was dying. Everything he'd been taught about leadership, about the natural order of society, about legitimate authority, had been tested and found wanting. The traditional Mongolia of competing tribes, inherited privileges, and noble bloodlines was being swept away. In its place rose something unprecedented, a meritocratic nation that promised opportunity to all but demanded absolute loyalty to one leader. The boy who had shared knuckle bones on a frozen river had become the most powerful man on the steppes. The universal ruler had been defeated by a vision more universal than his own. But Jamukha wasn't finished. Wounded, humiliated, stripped of most followers, he would fight on for 3 more years. The final act of their tragedy was yet to come. Chapter 7. The Final Hunt. 3 years passed, like a slow death on the steppes. Jamukha, once universal ruler of 13 tribes, now commanded barely 1,000 warriors. His great coalition had crumbled to dust, leaving him a shadow moving across the grasslands with the last believers in the old ways. Temujin, meanwhile, had grown into something the steppes had never seen. No longer just another tribal Khan, he commanded a true nation. His army swept across Mongolia like winter storms, absorbing enemies and expanding his vision of unified rule. Each victory brought him closer to an impossible dream, becoming Khan of all Mongols. But one enemy remained, one reminder of the past that refused to die. As long as Jamukha lived, Temujin's conquest remained incomplete. By the year 1203, Jamukha had found refuge with the Naiman tribe in the western mountains. The Naimans were the last great power that could challenge Temujin's dominance. Wealthy, organized, and led by Tayang Khan, who saw himself as the rightful ruler of all steppe peoples. The alliance made perfect sense. Jamukha brought knowledge of Temujin's tactics and the loyalty of the few tribes still resisting Mongol rule. Tayang Khan offered the military strength to make one final stand against the upstart from the east. But even this last hope carried the seeds of failure. Jamukha, brilliant in war, but poisoned by years of defeat, had become unpredictable. His hatred for Temujin now consumed him, making him dangerous even to his allies. Tayang Khan soon realized he had welcomed a man whose thirst for revenge might destroy them all. In the year 1204, the final confrontation came at Chakirmot, near Mount Naku in the Altai Mountains. Temujin pursued the Naiman Jamukha alliance into their mountain stronghold, where the fate of Mongolia would be decided once and for all. The battle began like so many others: waves of mounted archers, the thunder of hooves, the whistle of arrows darkening the sky. But as the fighting intensified, something extraordinary happened. At the critical moment when Taiang Khan's forces seemed capable of holding their ground, Jamukha made a choice that shocked everyone present. He abandoned the field. Without warning, without explanation, he led his remaining followers away from the battle, leaving the Naimans to face Temujin alone. Why? Some said cowardice. Others claimed treachery. The truth was more complex and more tragic. Jamukha had finally understood that his cause was hopeless. Better to preserve what little remained of his following than watch them die in a futile last stand. His desertion shattered Naiman morale. Taiang Khan, seeing his numerical advantage disappear, ordered his troops into a defensive square. It was exactly the wrong move. Temujin's cavalry swept around the flanks, enveloping the static formation. Panic spread through Naiman ranks as warriors began fleeing toward the mountain ravines. The slaughter was terrible. Taiang Khan died fighting. His son Kuchlug fled west with a handful of survivors. The Naiman power was broken forever, their lands absorbed into Temujin's growing empire. Jamukha escaped the massacre, but his world had finally ended. The last great tribe that could have challenged Temujin was destroyed. No one else would risk harboring the defeated universal ruler. He was alone now, except for a few dozen followers who stayed loyal out of pity rather than hope. For 2 more years, Jamukha wandered the steppes like a ghost from the past. Sometimes he raided isolated settlements for supplies. Occasionally he sent messages to former allies seeking refuge or support. But the responses were always the same: surrender to Temujin or remain in exile forever. His followers began to desert him one by one. Men who had served his family for generations quietly slipped away in the night, seeking mercy from the new order rather than death with the old. By the year 1206, Jamukha commanded perhaps 20 warriors in a land where Temujin ruled hundreds of thousands. It was then that his closest companions made their final betrayal. These men who had shared his bread, fought at his side, and remained loyal through every defeat, finally accepted the inevitable. They seized Jamukha while he slept and bound him with ropes like a common criminal. Their leader, a man who had served Jamukha's father before him, spoke the words that ended an era. The steppes belong to Temujin now. We cannot follow a dead man anymore. They brought their former Khan to Temujin's camp, like hunters presenting a captured wolf. But their expected reward turned to horror when Temujin heard what they had done. These men had committed the ultimate crime in Mongol law, betraying their sworn leader. "You who would sell your own Khan," Temujin said coldly, "what loyalty could you possibly offer me?" He ordered them executed on the spot, their bodies left unburied as a warning to all who might consider similar treachery. Now Temujin and Jamukha faced each other for the last time. the boy who had shared knuckle bones on a frozen river, and the man who would soon be called Genghis Khan. Two paths that had begun together and led to this moment of ultimate reckoning. Around them, the great Mongol camp stretched to the horizon, girs housing warriors from dozens of tribes, horses beyond counting, the apparatus of a nation preparing for world conquest. Everything Jamukha had once dreamed of commanding, everything he had lost through his adherence to traditions that no longer served the steppes. The final conversation between the sworn brothers would determine not just Jamukha's fate, but the kind of empire Temujin would build. In the silence between them lay 20 years of friendship, rivalry, war, and the ghosts of the world they had both helped to destroy. Chapter 8. The Last Meeting. Two men faced each other across 20 years of brotherhood turned to blood. In the pre-dawn silence of the great tent, the past and future of Mongolia hung in the balance. Jamukha sat bound but unbroken, grey touching his temples, lines marking his face where laughter once lived. His eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had commanded 13 tribes and challenged an empire. Temujin studied his oldest friend. Here was the man who had helped rescue Berta, who had shared knuckle bones on frozen rivers, who had been closer than blood. Here too was the enemy who represented everything that kept Mongolia weak and divided. My Anda, Temujin said quietly, after all these years. You have won everything, Temujin. Jamukha's voice carried exhaustion and pride. The steppes bow before you. What use could there be now for your old friend? The words hung between them like a blade. Both understood this moment's terrible weight. Join me, Temujin offered, though the hollow ring betrayed him. Help me build what we once dreamed together. Jamukha shook his head. There can be only one sun in the sky, only one Khan over all tribes. If I accepted, I would haunt your dreams in the dark night and trouble your heart in the bright day. I would be the louse in your collar, the splinter in your door. Even facing death, Jamukha chose defiance over submission. It was what had always made him magnificent and what had ultimately destroyed him. Then what would you have me do? Kill me, Jamukha said simply. But grant me a noble death. Let no blood stain the earth. By our old friendship, let me die as befits the last of the old Khans. The request followed Mongol tradition. Nobles died without spilling blood, their spirits passing cleanly to the next world. But it meant the final severing of every tie to their shared past. You ask me to kill my own brother. I ask you to free us both. You from an enemy who reminds you of weakness. Me from a world where everything I believed has turned to dust. Outside, the vast camp stirred to life. Soon, thousands would wake to serve a Khan who commanded absolute loyalty. The old Mongolia was dying with the dawn. Very well, Temujin whispered. I grant your request. For the first time since capture, Jamukha smiled. Thank you, brother. When you build your empire, remember that our rivalry shaped everything you achieved. Without me to challenge you, none of this would exist. It was terrible, but it was the truth. Jamukha's resistance had forged Temujin into something greater than either could have become alone. In destroying his greatest enemy, Temujin destroyed the crucible that created him. I will bury you in the golden belt you gave me, a symbol of the brotherhood we shared. Then let it be finished. The execution was swift. Jamukha died without crying out, his back broken by trusted warriors who honored ancient customs. No blood touched the ground. His spirit flew free to the eternal blue sky. Temujin kept his word. He wrapped Jamukha's body in the golden belt from their youth and buried him on a high hill overlooking the steppes where both were born. As earth covered his oldest friend, Temujin felt the last connection to his past severed. The boy who had shared knuckle bones was gone forever. In his place stood the man who would soon be called Genghis Khan. But late at night, alone in his tent, he would remember a frozen river and two children making promises they could never keep. The price of empire, he learned, was paid not just in enemy blood, but in the death of everything that had once made you human. Chapter 9. The Empire Built on Betrayal. It was spring in the year 1206. At the sacred mountain near the source of the Onon River, 10,000 warriors gathered for a ceremony that would change the world. The great Kurultai, the assembly of all Mongol chiefs, had convened to proclaim their universal leader. Temujin knelt before the sacred blue banner as shamans chanted prayers to the eternal sky. When he rose, he was no longer simply another tribal Khan. He was Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, master of all peoples between the sunrise and sunset. But in the moment of his greatest triumph, Temujin felt only emptiness. The man who should have shared this victory lay buried on a distant hill, wrapped in a golden belt from their youth. Every banner that flew for Genghis Khan was also a monument to Jamukha's defeat. The assembled chiefs prostrated themselves before their new emperor. Mongols, Karaites, Tatars, Merkids, tribes that had warred for generations, now knelt as one people. It was everything Temujin had dreamed of as a boy, everything Jamukha had died opposing. You have united what was scattered, proclaimed the senior shaman. You have made one nation from many tribes. The eternal blue sky has ordained this day. Had it, or had this empire been built not on divine mandate, but on the bones of everyone who had believed in older, gentler ways of living? Jamukha's final words echoed in the new emperor's mind. Without me to challenge you, none of this would exist. The truth was darker than the shamans knew. This empire had indeed been forged in the crucible of their rivalry. Every innovation that made Genghis Khan great had been born from the need to defeat Jamukha. The meritocratic army, the unified command structure, the integration of conquered peoples, all responses to the challenge posed by traditional tribal authority. But what had been lost in the creation of this new world? The steppes that had once echoed with the laughter of independent tribes now moved to the rhythm of a single will. The chaotic freedom of nomad life had been replaced by iron discipline and absolute loyalty to one man. Jamukha had represented more than just political opposition. He had embodied the ancient ways, the belief that leadership came from noble blood, that tribes should remain separate, that tradition mattered more than innovation. His death marked the end of an entire way of life. As the ceremony continued, Genghis Khan felt the weight of what he had become. The boy who had played with knucklebones was truly gone. In his place sat a man who commanded the loyalty of millions, but could never again have a friend who challenged him, questioned him, or reminded him of his humanity. The empire that would emerge from this moment would indeed stretch from Korea to Hungary. Mongol armies would humble Chinese dynasties, topple Islamic kingdoms, and terrorize European nations. Cities would fall, cultures would be transformed, and the world would never be the same. But every conquest would carry the ghost of Jamukha. Every city that burned would echo with his warnings about the cost of unity. Every innovation that strengthened the Mongol war machine would remind Genghis Khan of the friend who had forced him to become more than he was. The assembled chiefs began to chant, "Genghis Khan! Genghis Khan!" Their voices rose like thunder across the steppes, proclaiming the birth of an empire. Yet beneath the celebration lay a profound sadness that only one man truly understood. This was the empire built on betrayal, not just Jamukha's betrayal by his own followers, but Temujin's betrayal of everything he had once been. The price of uniting Mongolia had been the destruction of the very bonds that made such unity meaningful. In the months that followed, Genghis Khan would implement the lessons learned from 20 years of warfare with his blood brother. He created the decimal system that organized his army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. He promoted based on merit rather than birth. He integrated defeated enemies rather than destroying them. He built a nation that could conquer the world. But late at night, when the camp was quiet and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, he would sometimes think of two boys on a frozen river, sharing dice made from bone and making promises they believed would last forever. The greatest empire in human history had been born from the death of the greatest friendship the steppes had ever known. And somewhere in the darkness, Genghis Khan wondered if the trade had been worth it. The universal ruler commanded everything under the sky, but he would spend the rest of his life learning that some victories cost more than any defeat ever could. Chapter 10: The Legacy of Broken Brotherhood. After the Kurultai, the wind across the steppe did not soften. It still carried the smell of smoke and horse, victory songs mixed with whispers of betrayal. Genghis Khan wore the title the shamans had spoken, and every sunrise revealed its weight. The laws he set down, later called the Yasa, were not scrolls but living judgments. A thief knew the price. A soldier knew his share. Even enemies could earn a place by courage. His armies moved in rhythm. 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Order had replaced chaos. The horizon was no longer a border, but a road. With order came reach. Khwarezm fell to fire. China tested its walls and learned patience could break stone. Everywhere the ties of tribe were cut and retied to one man's vision. Yet at night another presence sat in his tent, Jamukha, silent, wrapped in the golden belt of their youth. No blame, no pardon, only the reminder of a promise broken. By day he looked at his sons, Joki, shadowed by whispers of another father, Chagatai, hard and exact, Ogedei, steady and warm, Tolui, young and fierce. He told them the empire was no inheritance, but an animal to feed and groom. He chose Ogedai to hold the tent pole upright when the winds came. It brought peace for the nation, if not always for him. Still, doubts returned. A murdered envoy, a sultan's insult answered in ash. Cities learned too late that closed gates can cost every breath inside. His commanders grew sharp with practice. He pulled them back when cruelty threatened to outshine discipline. Sometimes he failed. Too many names turned to smoke. History would argue over numbers. History would not lie awake and hear the voice he heard. Without me to challenge you, none of this would exist. The white spirit banner still breathed in the wind. Men circled it when omens pressed close to earth. He let them believe, but remembered what belief had cost. Faith is a knife, safe by the handle, deadly by the blade. From the west came a crack. The Tangut rulers of Western Jia tested his patience with light tribute and slow words. He called the banners. His old horse lifted its head as if it, too, had heard. This last campaign opened like doors he had entered before. Winter crossings, supply herds arriving just before hunger, feigned retreats that pulled defenders into ruin. Age had not dulled his instinct for where a line would break. It had only made the cost sharper in his bones. Sickness found him in the camp. Fever pressed its hand against his brow. He did not show it. He had taught his men to read orders, not sighs. He held one command for himself. Finish what was begun. Take the treaty. Do not give winter to the other side. It was done. The Tangut court bent to his will. The army turned for home. He did not. He called those who had carried his standards and saddled his horses since boyhood. To them he spoke of burial. No monuments. No stones to tempt thieves. No shrine to bind the living. The earth would guard its secret. Rivers might learn a new path for a day, then forget. The spirit banner would go on breathing. To his sons, he spoke of weight, not gold, but choice. Keep knives sharp for enemies and dull for each other. Hold doubt as a tool, not a poison. Remember winter promises when summer tempts forgetting. He did not name Jamukha. He did not need to. That night the stars leaned low. Somewhere a boy laughed in his sleep. Somewhere a mare called for her foal. He saw again the frozen river, the dice clattering across the ice, the moment two children had bound themselves as brothers. The last gift he could never return lay heavy in his chest. His final breath was no shout, only a curtain drawn. Outside, the guard changed. Inside, a hand grew still. Morning brought work. They wrapped what needed wrapping, spoke words the wind could carry better than ink, and rode on, because to stop is to starve. The empire widened after him. It fractured and was mended and fractured again. It wrote its name on maps that had never known the step. It wrote other names too, places where lamplight once warmed bread and later warmed nothing. What endured where maps could not reach was simpler. The memory of a boy who kept his word when the world taught him to break it. The truth that iron is shaped by fire and by water, by enemy and by friend. The eternal blue sky took back what it had lent. The people said their lives were safer under laws that asked no man his father's name. Enemies said what enemies must. The wind said nothing. It moved over the grass the way it always had, and somewhere far off, it still sounded like knuckle bones on ice.